It's been just 1 week. This seems crazy to me, but it has only been 1 week since our impeached president was acquitted in the Senate 1 week ago. And the abuses of power just keep going, intensifying. In fact, this week, President Trump has been openly assaulting the independence of the Department of Justice. And the behavior has become so routine. But what he is doing now, I would say, is even more destructive than anything he's done before, even than what he was impeached for. And amidst all this, as you watch these headlines that are kind of dizzying, I think it's fair to say, in the last week, it's really important to understand that the only thing standing between the rule of law and a kind of authoritarian decline is us. It's not any law anywhere, and it's certainly not the words as written in the Constitution. The laws we have, the institutions we have, those are all vitally important. But fundamentally, we are what stands in the way. And here's what I mean by that. The Department of Justice, right? It's currently being openly subverted and corrupted in front of our eyes by the president and his handpicked bagman, for lack of a better word, Attorney General William Barr. But here's the thing. The Department of Justice is not in the U.S. Constitution. That phrase, the Department of Justice, it doesn't exist in the text because there was not a Department of Justice for almost another century after ratification. There was not an FBI. There were barely any federal crimes right around the time the Constitution was adopted. It was the states that did all that. And that was the case for nearly the first 100 years of the country. The Department of Justice was actually created by statute after the Civil War. And over the years, it's grown in scope and power. And when it was created, there was no constitutional delineation or demarcation about the relationship between the president and this massive law enforcement body that he started to run. It's interesting. The first mission of the DOJ was actually to bring the rule of law to the post-Confederate South, where local juries and local investigators would not prosecute violent white terrorism. Federal investigators had to do that. But over the next 100 years, between when it was created in the 1870s and the Watergate scandal in the 1970s, the Department of Justice gets very, very powerful. In 1908, the FBI is created, and then J. Edgar Hoover, who you know of, right? He takes it over in 1924. He runs it for almost 50 years, 5 decades. Think about that. And Hoover, of course, turns it into his own personal fiefdom. He starts this incredibly intrusive surveillance system, targeting many of his personal enemies. He uses his power to essentially blackmail politicians, including presidents, right, to retain his power. His subordinates tried to get Martin Luther King Jr. to kill himself because Hoover was convinced he was a commie. J. Edgar Hoover abused his power, never left the post until his death in 1972. 1972. And then we get Watergate investigation in 1973, when President Richard Nixon actively tries to use the Department of Justice as a weapon to wield against his enemies. Remember what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, right? When Nixon tries to fire the special prosecutor that's investigating him, and when the Attorney General and then the Deputy Attorney General refuse to carry out his order, they resign in protest. And there's a realization after this, right? After Hoover, after Nixon and Watergate, that the misuse of the Department of Justice is just unbelievably dangerous, existentially threatening to the rule of law and democracy in general. And the government needs to have some kind of restraint on it because we cannot have the rule of law and we cannot certainly have impartial justice with the Department of Justice using its power to aid the agenda of one man, be it J. Edgar Hoover or Richard Nixon or Donald J. Trump. So the post-Watergate era included a number of reforms. Instead of being FBI director forever, for instance, they created a 10-year term. Probably a good idea. And the 10-year term, the idea was that presidents would not fire the FBI director when they came in, right? So they would cross administrations. But of course, we saw that too was basically just a tradition. And one of the biggest reforms was establishing a wall between the president and the Department of Justice on certain matters, right? And some of those are written into DOJ regulations that are internal to the department. But the crucial thing about all these reforms that are established post-Hoover and post-Nixon, they didn't come as amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Most of them are not laws at all. Many of them are norms and traditions and precedents. They are rules that presidents of both parties have more or less honored for decades. And the most important of all of these norms, the most important, is the separation between the White House and the president and the Department of Justice on criminal matters and investigations. And the reason for that is very clear. Look around the world right now. Dozens of countries. The prosecutorial function of the government is used by strongmen everywhere as a tool of pursuing and harassing and purging political opponents. In Russia, for just one example, right, the leader of the main opposition party there is a guy named Alexei Navalny. Maybe you've heard of him. And lo and behold, when he runs against Russian President Vladimir Putin, he gets nabbed by Russian federal agents, basically their version of the FBI, and gets brought up on charges over and over again. Now, do we think that's because Alexei Navalny is an incorrigible crook? Or because Putin is clearly using the prosecutorial power to target his political enemies? And that is what is so dangerous about where we are right now as I'm talking to you. There is nothing specifically and explicitly in our Constitution that says you can't do this. There are not laws that say the president can't, for instance, hand Attorney General Barr a list of all the people who've, contributed to Democratic presidential candidates at the maximum level and tell him the DOJ should open up investigations into those people. It's not technically illegal. It would obviously be an absolute descent into tin pot authoritarianism. We all know that. It would violate a whole bunch of Department of Justice regulations. It would violate established norms and decades of precedents of both parties. It probably violates the Fourth Amendment constitutional right to due process. But who's going to enforce that, right? Congress has oversight, of course. They could defund the Department of Justice. They still have the power of the purse. They could even impeach and remove the president over it, although that does not seem particularly likely today. And there are really two ways to wield the power of the Department of Justice as a kind of authoritarian tool, right? You can use it as a shield for your friends, and you can use it as a sword for your enemies. And we're watching right now in front of us, just in broad daylight, Attorney General Barr is using it as a shield for Donald Trump's friends. So first there's the intervention into the Roger Stone case, right? They rescind a sentencing recommendation, and then they replace it with a much, much lighter sentence against the recommendations of the prosecutors working the case. That leads all four of those line prosecutors to withdraw from the case. One even resigns from DOJ altogether. Today, we get news that, lo and behold, Attorney General Barr has installed an outside prosecutor to review the case against Michael Flynn, Trump's former national security advisor, a man who himself pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. And Roger Stone and Michael Flynn, they are the president's friends and allies and associates. The crimes they committed were committed in part, at least, to benefit the president himself. So the president does not want the law to touch them. So that's happening. Now, the much more terrifying precipice that we have not totally crossed yet is using the DOJ as a sword against Trump's perceived enemies, right? That's the Navalny example in Russia. But we've known from the time that he was on the campaign trail, Trump wants to do that. He wants to use the Department of Justice against his enemies the same way Putin does. He literally ran on lock her up. He tweeted at the first Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, all the time and time again, to investigate his political rivals. We know the president wanted James Comey prosecuted. We know that, thanks to the Washington Post, that Trump hit the roof when the DOJ declined to prosecute Comey. Quoting from the article, "Can you effing believe they did not charge him?" Trump reportedly said. And then Trump wanted Comey's successor, acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe, prosecuted because he opened up a counterintelligence investigation into Russian interference in the election and the campaign's possible ties, and also because his wife's a Democrat. That is some, real authoritarian stuff. Today, we got word that after months of extended back and forth about whether they would or would not actually indict McCabe, the DOJ said they are not going to prosecute him. And there's reporting today that Trump flipped out about that, too. But the thing is, here's the thing. An investigation itself, or the threat of an investigation, even without prosecution, creates unbelievable pressure and coercive force on political enemies. Just ask Andrew McCabe what the last 2 years of his life has been like, being under federal investigation. Heck, ask Joe Biden if just the threat of investigation can change the trajectory of your political fortunes. And that threat is a tool that authoritarians use as well. Earlier today, President Trump tweeted that he has the legal right to ask the Attorney General to intervene in a federal case. And again, here's the thing. In the most literal sense, he is not strictly wrong. There is nothing spelled out in the Constitution or spelled out in law that forbids this. There is no Department of Justice in the Constitution. But that does not mean there is no check. The restraint, the thing stopping the president from doing whatever he wants, are people. People mobilizing and organizing and calling switchboards of Congress and civil servants resigning inside the Department of Justice like those folks did, and then telling us what they know. Heck, people marching and protesting outside the Department of Justice, if that's what it takes. Because the only thing to stop him is us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.